Hi, I'm David Luong, and you're listening to Trek Rant, the Star Trek podcast where I rant, rave, overanalyze, and obsess about all things Trek. This is a quick mini podcast which I'll be doing, which you can find on the United Geek Federation's YouTube page or at our official website, www.unitedgeekfederation.wordpress.com. Today, I'll be talking about some of my favorite alien species throughout Star Trek lore. Now, Star Trek, obviously being a show about exploring strange new worlds and seeking out new life and new civilizations, obviously there have been just countless alien species featured throughout the entirety of all of the series. So basically, I'm just going to be looking at the tip of the iceberg and just going over my top 5 favorite alien species, as well as explaining why some of these are my favorite among the many aliens we've seen in Star Trek. So here goes nothing. First off, I'm going to start with the Riemanns from Star Trek Nemesis. I think I've mentioned in a previous podcast that I'm not quite sure why people don't like Nemesis more. It is my favorite of the Next Generation movies, alongside First Contact, and it's definitely a movie I love. And I think one of the reasons why I do love Nemesis so much is probably because of the Riemanns. They were these cool vampires in space. I remember reading that their look was inspired from Nosferatu, the old silent movie, and you can kind of see that with the design. I just love the look of the Riemanns, and alongside that, I really like the idea of them being this oppressed working class within Romulan society, them being completely almost slave labor, and their eventual rising up. I just love that, and I think that's just a cool angle to have. And they're one of those characters who they're very vicious looking, they're very predatorial, they look like predators, but at the same time, and maybe it's just me, I can't help but want to cheer for those characters because they were oppressed by the Romulans. And I think I mentioned in the previous podcast as well that I really like Shinzon, so maybe that has something to do with that they did raise him. I don't know. In any case, the Riemanns, one of my favorite alien species, just these cool, shadowy, I want to say bat-like, but maybe that's not what I want to say, but vampire characters who just are awesome, and who they're just trying to rebel and just trying to get themselves out from underneath the shadow of Romulan rule. So how cool is that, right? Next on my list, again, this might be an oddball choice for some people, but I really love the Xindi from Star Trek Enterprise. I love the idea that these multiple species would evolve alongside one another. The amphibians, the insectoids, the sloths, and the more human of the Xindi. I just think that's a really cool concept, and it was really cool that they all look very different from one another, but they would have some similarities so that you could believe that they all basically evolved in parallel to one another. My personal favorite of the Xindi species would be the insectoids and the amphibians. I know that some people don't always like heavy CGI characters, but I thought that it suited Enterprise for the time, and I just think it was really cool seeing that different looking an alien species, that basically non-humanoid character appearing on a Star Trek television series. I don't think there's ever been, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I don't think that there's ever been on any of the TV series prior to that an insect-looking alien like the Xindi insectoids, and I just always thought they looked really cool, as well as the amphibians, like I mentioned. The fact that they were literally underwater every time you saw them was just pretty awesome. It just made them look so different from any other alien species that appeared in Star Trek before or since. So definitely I love the Xindi as a whole, but in particular the insectoids and the amphibians. And I did like them as antagonists in general. That third season of Star Trek Enterprise was one of my favorite seasons across any of the shows. So I just love the Xindi. For my next 2 alien species on my list, they're basically tied in the third and second position of my top 5 alien species, and probably appropriately so. They're the Vulcans and the Romulans. I think for the Vulcans, I think we all love the Vulcans because of Spock from Star Trek, the original series. But when you look at the Vulcans across the entirety of Star Trek, Spock, Tuvok, to Paul, there are all these characters who basically represent the ability to think logically and to think outside of ourselves, to have this great rational view of the world. Now, I did have some issues with how Enterprise depicted the Vulcans throughout, but for the most part, the Vulcan depictions throughout the rest of Star Trek have been fairly consistent and fair. I would consider fairly good. I just love the idea of this alien species who they're mostly benevolent, and they're able to look at us humans, step back and say, okay, what you're doing isn't rational, what you're doing isn't logical. Let me tell you what, from a subjective point of view, what an unemotional view of this particular situation is. I love that about the Vulcans. And I think I've told people this before, and I think I mentioned it in one of our Kid Clown Kicker podcast episodes, the other Geek Roundtable podcast, which you can find on our YouTube page or in our website, www.unitegeekfederation.wordpress.com, that if I were to meet an alien species in real life, I think I would want them to be the Vulcans. I just think that would be awesome if we do encounter aliens ever, if aliens exist, that if they were like the Vulcans, I think I'd be okay with that. I think I'd be more than okay with that. I would love that. So if aliens do exist, and by some strange coincidence, or maybe just like Star Trek podcast, that you're listening to this particular Star Trek podcast, feel free to come and meet me. I'd love that. I would just absolutely love that. In any case, like I said, the Vulcans are tied with the Romulans in my third/second place position in my top 5 favorite alien species. The Romulans, I like them for different reasons than I like the Vulcans, but I like them equally, if that at all makes sense. The Romulans are just these smart, conniving bureaucrats who you get the sense that on their home world, the politics are just so harsh, and that they're constantly maneuvering for position, just trying to find ways to get power within the system. And I just find that inherently really fascinating. They're these smart, conniving villains. In a weird way, I've always considered them the most human of the alien species that you'll encounter in Star Trek, that you can almost see a lot of and I don't mean to get too political by any means, but you can almost see a little bit of our politics, of our ability to worm our way into position and to make power grabs. You can almost see a little bit of Romulans and humans and Romulans. So I think I find that really fascinating. I think in general, the Vulcans and Romulans, they almost represent different sides of humanity, both the positives and the negatives. The Vulcans very much the species who, something that I think humans need more often, this great ability to think rationally, to think logically, but at the same time to be able to express feelings of loyalty and friendship. I think that the Vulcans have a lot of, it's a strange thing to say, but they're very human in that sense. Whereas the Romulans, being these very, very wily, very, very passionate, yet, I think I've used this word several times already, but I'll say it again, conniving characters. I think you can see a lot of humans and Romulans and Romulans and humans. So again, the Vulcans and Romulans kind of depicting different sides of humanity for both good and bad. Last on my list, and I think my favorite alien species throughout the whole entirety of Star Trek, and it's probably an obvious choice, but I'm going to go with the Klingons. Of course, this is probably an episode unto itself, but just briefly, the reason that I love the Klingons are, there are multiple reasons I love the Klingons. First off, that they're probably the most fleshed out of any of the alien species that appear throughout Star Trek. They've appeared in countless episodes. You've seen, I think you've seen more Klingon characters than any other alien species in Star Trek. So you really do get an idea of the entire range of different types of Klingons. While at the same time, while you do get a lot of different Klingons who all act differently from one another. Worf is a very different person from Gowron, who in turn is a very different person than Martok, who's a very different person from the Duras sisters, and et cetera, et cetera. But while they're all different characters, you can look at them all and get the idea that they all grew up under the same culture And I think that's really fascinating. And to me, that's really great writing, by the way, that you can depict multiple characters who are so unique from one another, but you can all see them coming from the same root culture, the same alien species. I just love that you can get that different view of the same planet from different people. I think the other thing is that to me, a lot of the appeal of Klingons comes from them being a warrior culture. I think that deep down, for all of us, for all humans, we all wish that we could whip out a bat'leth or something like that when somebody pisses us off. I don't know, like during morning traffic. I think we all wish that we could occasionally whip out our honor swords and just have a duel right there and then in the middle of traffic. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. So I think that there's this great freedom that comes with the Klingons that appeals to us humans. But at the same time, when you look at the Klingons, there's this great underlying philosophy, this great serenity underneath the exterior of violence, under the exterior of being warriors. Basically not unlike samurai culture. That reminds us that the Klingons aren't just about undirected violence. They're not just violence for the sake of violence. Ultimately, the Klingons are fighting for things, whether you agree with them or not. The Klingons are fighting for things which appeal to humanity, like nobility, family, your people, and of course, honor. So that's just this great thing about the Klingons, that whether they're enemies to the Federation or they're allies of the Federation or everything in between, you have to respect them. And I think there's a lot that you can see of humanity in the Klingons. I think I said this about the Riemanns and Vulcans, but I'll say it about the Klingons as well. There's a lot about humanity you can see in the Klingons, and Klingons that you can see in humanity, about wanting that freedom, wanting that ability to stand up for what's right, and about being strong enough to stand up for what's right, while at the same time having that philosophy, having that warrior culture, a philosophy underneath it that guides you to do the right thing ultimately. So that it's not just violence for the sake of violence, like I said, but ultimately for causes that you truly believe in and that are ultimately noble and honorable and good. A key word, of course, there being honor. Of course, that's a huge thing in Klingon culture. At any case, just to recap, my top 5 favorite species in Star Trek lore: the Riemanns, the Xindi, and maybe that's a little bit of a cheat since the Xindi, I guess you can consider them technically multiple species, but I'm going to put them all in one bucket anyway. Next 2 are tied with one another, the Vulcans and the Romulans, and of course my number 1 favorite alien species throughout all of Star Trek, the Klingons. I probably did leave out a lot of other people's favorites. I'm thinking right now that I left out the Cardassians, the Bajorans, the Ferengi, the Andorians, the Orions, the Q Continuum, the Borg, and so on and so forth. I think that there are just so many different alien species in Star Trek, and I think that's just absolutely wonderful because each of them tell a different story about humanity, that they show a different aspect of who we are by depicting them as these fictional alien species on Star Trek. And I think that's just one of the reasons I love Star Trek, and why I think just going through this list, it just made me a little happier, just reminding me just one of the many reasons I love Star Trek so much, that you do get a variety of alien species, and such great alien species with great histories behind them. At any case, what do you think? Did I leave out any of your favorite alien species? Who are some of your favorites? Please leave a comment on this YouTube page or visit us at our official website at www.unitedgeekfederation.wordpress.com and leave a comment. Also, please subscribe so you can receive updates on future podcasts, not just this one, but other shows on the United Geek Federation channel. I'm David Luong. Thanks for listening to Trek Rant.